Let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's explainer. Today we're looking at one of the most notoriously punishing video games ever created. The kind that literally makes you want to launch your controller across the living room after you've just lost 3 hours of progress to some basic skeleton. But we're going to uncover how this brutal game is actually a profound teacher of existential philosophy. Seriously, if you've ever felt completely lost or overwhelmed, this explainer is absolutely for you.
So it begs a pretty huge question. Why do millions of players voluntarily subject themselves to a brutal, punishing experience? One that offers zero guidance, totally lacks reassurance, and fundamentally just doesn't care if they succeed or fail? It kind of seems counterintuitive to everything we normally expect from entertainment, right? To figure that out, we're drawing from a really fascinating 2025 thesis out of Uppsala University, put together by researchers Celine Araz and Jonathan Hedval. They conducted this deep, experiential study on this exact topic. And it turns out what their research reveals is pretty amazing. They found that this specific game, rather than just frustrating players to no end, actually cultivates a deep sense of personal meaning and existential freedom. Okay, let's get into section 1, an indifferent game world, the shock of Lord Dran. Think about traditional game design for a second. You usually get these really explicit quest markers, heavy guidance, arrows pointing exactly where to go. But Dark Souls, it strips all of that away. There's no heads-up display guiding your path, the storytelling is totally cryptic, and the world itself is entirely indifferent to you. You aren't some chosen hero destined for greatness, you're just an insignificant character dropped into a deeply hostile environment. The researchers actually connect this exact feeling of disorientation to a heavy philosophical concept by Martin Heidegger. It's called thrownness, or Giverfenheit. It's basically the idea that human existence is just randomly dropped or thrown into a pre-existing, confusing world without a map or an instruction manual. And in Dark Souls, this is literal. Your character wakes up in a prison cell with nothing but the basic controls. The world was spinning long before you got there, and it's going to keep spinning whether you figure it out or not.
Which brings us to a really crucial mechanic in the game, the hollow. In the game's lore, a hollow is an undead character who has completely lost their humanity, their purpose, and their sanity. But the researchers point out this brilliant meta-narrative here. You, as the player character, are also cursed with immortality. You only truly die, you only truly become hollow, when you, the actual person holding the controller, decide to give up, turn off the console, and walk away. The game mechanically ties your real-world perseverance directly to your character's sanity. How wild is that?
Moving on to section 2, the philosophy of play. Struggle as meaning. It all starts with this famous quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, "Existence precedes essence." Sartre argued that we aren't born with some pre-packaged purpose or a grand destiny. Nope, first we exist, and then we have to define our own essence through our actions. Because Dark Souls gives you zero clear direction or moral structure, you are radically free. You are forced to create your own meaning and forge your own path, despite the incredibly oppressive constraints of the game. And we can actually map these massive philosophical concepts directly onto the gameplay. First, we see Sartre's radical freedom mirrored in how we have to navigate the world without any fixed goals. Then we have Albert Camus' concept of absurdity, which is perfectly simulated by the game's endless loop of dying, losing all your progress and having to try again. And finally, Heidegger's thrownness, which we talked about, simulated by being dropped into that confusing world with minimal exposition. The game is literally a working laboratory for existentialism. Because the game totally lacks what the researchers call a prescribed game purpose, like an explicit objective handed to you, it demands what they call existential agency. This is a really key term for us. It means the burden of choice shifts entirely onto your shoulders. You have to develop your own player purpose. You aren't pushing forward because a glowing quest marker told you to. You're pushing forward because you decided it matters. Which leads us to section 3, meaning in absurdity, the Sisyphean struggle. The researchers draw a direct line between the game's famously punishing death mechanics and the philosopher Albert Camus. In the game, when you die, you lose your souls, which are your currency and experience points, and you lose your humanity. You then have to fight your way all the way back to exactly where you died just to retrieve them, or they're gone forever. It is the digital equivalent of the myth of Sisyphus, rolling that massive boulder up a hill only to watch it roll right back down. It's an utterly absurd struggle, but amazingly, that is exactly where the meaning is forged.
This highlights a really fascinating concept coined by game scholar Daniel Vella called the ludic sublime. It's this beautiful, delicate tension between mastery and mystery. You see, the enjoyment doesn't just come from finally beating the game. The real magic happens in that mysterious, uncertain space right before you fully understand the world. That obscurity and ambiguity, it invites you to interpret the world for yourself, creating this deeply personal connection that a fully explained, hand-holding game could just never achieve. Let's look at how they build this in Section 4, Designing Freedom, an Indifferent World. So, how do you actually design an indifferent world? The developers used some very specific, intentional design choices to foster this environment. First, there's expositional ambiguity, basically intentionally withholding a clear narrative from the player. Then, they use vague environmental storytelling. This forces you to literally look at the physical architecture and the ruins just to understand the lore. The spaces are completely interconnected without traditional loading screens, making the world feel incredibly real and imposing. Plus, the non-player characters, the NPCs, act totally independently. They aren't obsessed with you. They have their own tragic storylines that just play out whether you help them or not. And of course, there are those punishing high-stakes mechanics we mentioned earlier. There's a great quote from the thesis that summarizes this design philosophy perfectly. They note that Dark Souls cultivates existential agency not through explicit instruction, but through the constraints of its world design. It's not about having a wide-open sandbox with zero rules. True existential freedom here is all about finding expressive, self-authored meaning within incredibly strict, unapologetic constraints. The sheer resistance of the world is exactly what gives your choices weight.
Moving into our final part, Section 5, the player's experience, studying the struggle.
To actually capture this whole experience, the researchers used what they call an auto-hermeneutic phenomenological approach. Now I know that sounds like a massive academic mouthful, but it's actually pretty intuitive. It's essentially a continuous loop. Step 1, they played the game iteratively. Step 2, they meticulously journaled and logged exactly how the spatial design and the ambiguity made them feel. And Step 3, they deeply reflected on those logs through a philosophical lens. Then, they just repeated the cycle. They weren't crunching massive data sets of player statistics. They were studying the game as a lived, highly subjective personal experience. And that brings us to the core takeaway from their entire thesis. Games, and honestly, perhaps experiences in general, aren't just static texts or mechanical constructs that impose meaning onto you. They are experiential spaces. Meaning is generated solely through your active, interpretive engagement with the world. You literally get out of it what you put into navigating its darkness. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. When everything is explained to you, when your purpose is just handed to you on a silver platter, and every single step is guided, are you truly exercising your freedom? If a game holds your hand entirely, are you truly playing it, or is it playing you? Think about the value of struggle and ambiguity, not just in the digital worlds we explore, but in life itself. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the path ahead.